All right, so if you recall what we were talking about last time, I was making the hard sell for markets as a way of allocating stuff and tasks, and why it's going to be efficient in that job as long as we're talking about competitive markets, right? And I also mentioned, we'll talk after the midterm about some of the ways in which that is not entirely correct, but it's good to know what power there is in our hands here, so that at least if we're going to go away from it, we got to have a good reason, right? We got to know why we think that this does not work in a particular situation, because we're giving up a lot by not doing it. So, you recall we were talking about snow shovels and how a change in a shift in the market means that people are going to be chasing those profits, which means the stuff that we need is going to go where it needs to go at the time that we need it. And also those prices are going to get driven towards a profit of zero and low production costs, given enough time for adjustment. So in the long run, after we have time to adjust, in the case of the snowstorm, after all the snow shovel people have time to move from Tacoma to Seattle, sell their snow shovels, if it happens for long enough, goods are going to be produced at zero economic profit. The amount that's going to be produced is the appropriate amount that society wants. All people who value something more than it costs to produce are going to get it. Everybody who does not care as much about it is not. However, in the short run, there's going to be some profits probably, right? The person who has the snow shovel store in Seattle is going to make some price gouging prices for a little while until the competition comes in. But as long as the adjustments can happen, it's not going to last for long. It also means that the system produces the largest amount of surplus, right? Not just in a given static market. We saw that you get to that equilibrium point, that's the total surplus being as large as possible. But it also means that over time it sends resources where they need to be, puts them into their most efficient resource use. A bunch of snow shovels sitting in Tacoma where they're not needed. Remember, we talked about this before. Efficiency is when society's marginal benefit equals society's marginal cost. And we talked about this as well. Reminder. We have a regular old supply and demand curve. Here's our equilibrium. We know, given the definition of supply and demand curves, that if we follow the quantity up and where it hits demand, that is going to be our marginal benefit for the consumer. How much additional benefit they received because they got that one unit. We follow it up to the supply curve, which happens to be the exact same point right here, the marginal cost for the producer. So when we get to that equilibrium point in the supply and demand model, the marginal benefit for the consumer, which also represents the marginal benefit from society's point of view, because why does society want to produce a thing? So that somebody will get some sort of enjoyment out of it, or their lives will become better in some way. That's going to be equal to the marginal cost, which is also the marginal cost to society as a whole. What are the costs to society of producing something? Well, it is the cost of the resources that went into it, which is also what the supplier had to pay in order to do it. So those two things are equal, which means that from society's point of view, we have produced the efficient quantity of this particular good, right? The last unit that's produced provides exactly as much benefit to whoever gets it as it costs to produce. It means that our total surplus is maximized overall. Consumer surplus up here next to the demand curve, producer surplus down here next to the supply curve. From society's point of view, we don't necessarily care about how those two things are distributed, but what we do care about is that this whole triangle is filled, right? This is our total surplus. Right, which is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, and that's as big as it possibly can be. You cannot pick a different quantity that makes that bigger. Now, we gave the example before of a case where the supplier of the snow shovels was not going to adjust their price for their own choice, right? They were afraid of the backlash that they would receive. They decided not to adjust their price for that reason, and that led us to an excess demand where things were not being allocated efficiently. That is one way in which you could end up with the price not adjusting fully. There could also be government regulation that could put restrictions on what price could be, right? Commonly, you might see something, things called price ceilings or price floors, which also might be price maximums or price minimums. And these are commonly used by governments to try to change what price is in the market for various reasons. So in the case of a price ceiling, we're talking about a law that says you are not allowed to sell something for more than a certain price. And you can imagine why you might do this, right? If you think, hey, this thing is too expensive, we are going to force people to not sell it for that much. We're going to force the price to go down. That is basically what a price ceiling is. From the point of view of the producers, the price has dropped, which in the same way in this as in the snow shovel scenario causes them to produce less. And in the long run, some of them are going to drop out of the market because they're going to be making a loss relative to what they could be doing. This also means that resources that are particularly well suited for what that good might go towards something else instead. Right, so if we're talking about a price ceiling on wheat, if you're like, hey, I think wheat's too expensive, we're going to force people to sell it for less money so that it's less expensive. There's going to be some farmers out there who would be growing wheat if the price were at the equilibrium amount, but because it's lower, they're going to say wheat's not really where it's at anymore. I'm going to go make something else. I'm going to go grow corn or something, even if that land is better suited for growing wheat than for growing corn, and then you have less efficient land use. You also end up with that excess demand, right? At that artificially low price, you have consumers who would be willing to pay producers a higher price at a price that the producers would accept, but they can't, they're not allowed to. So one place where this pops up a lot is, at least in current conversations, is rent control, right? This is probably the most discussed current active topic when you're talking about price control, right? So I guess that and the minimum wage, and we'll talk about that. But rent controls are examples. So rent controls place a price ceiling on certain apartment prices, or at least certain apartments you're not allowed to charge above a certain amount. That's what a price control is, or that's what rent control is. You are not allowed to rent the apartment above that price. It could apply broadly, it could apply to a specific set of apartments, whatever it is. So what we'd expect from this, if the price ceiling is put in place, you'd expect that producers of apartments are going to have then less incentive to make apartments. They're going to make fewer apartments than they otherwise would. You're building an apartment building and someone says you're not allowed to charge the market rate for that. They might say, well, I guess I'm not going to make an apartment building anymore. Now I'm going to make an office building instead. Still going to build the building, but it's not going to be apartments, which means that you're going to end up with a smaller quantity of apartments available. And while the price is going to be lower, you're going to end up with a lot of people who want to rent at that price, but cannot find one to rent. Right? So you're going to have long waiting lists for those rent control apartments, people not able to get into them. Now, if you can get in, right, that's great. Consumers win out of this arrangement if they can find an apartment, right? It's great for the consumer if they can find an apartment. Because like, if you look over here, right, just look at this slice of the market, where would this be at equilibrium? If we just looked at these people over here. In an equilibrium market, here's where the price would be, right? So in that case, right, you can see how the consumer surplus would be smaller and the producer surplus would be bigger. So among the apartments that get rented, this is definitely shifting resources and efficiency, resources and surplus away from the producers towards the consumers. It's doing what it's intended to do, right? But that's only for the people who actually get an apartment. Over here, you get people who are willing to pay for an apartment at prices that would cover what the costs are to produce it, but they're not going to do it because the suppliers are not allowed to charge them enough to make it worth their while. So if we think about what the costs and benefits are of a policy like this, obviously producers are not happy about it. Consumers are loving it if they can find an apartment, but there are going to be some consumers who cannot find an apartment, and as a result, they would actually be made worse off by the policy. And then the real question is, how big is this triangle? I've drawn it so that it's really big relative to these. Is it actually that big? Is it bigger? Is it smaller? Right, that would be a context-specific question. So if the goal is to provide low-cost apartments, but you use rent controls to implement that goal, you end up with an excess demand of apartments. Price is low, people want the apartments, but they can't find one. And then you get back to that allocation question that we talked about before, right? Just like in the snow shovel example, we're not willing to use the price to allocate this good. So there's going to be more people who want one than can get one. And then you have to find some other way of deciding who's going to get one. You get back to that same question. You have to pick one of the alternative methods of figuring out who's going to get the stuff. You can't get away from that question. It's sort of annoying, right? Whatever way you have of allocating stuff, there always has to be a decision at some point about how you do that. It can't just magically occur. You have to ask who's going to get the low-cost apartments. And the same things we talked about before could come back into play. Those with power or influence will often find a way to be the ones who get to consume the underpriced goods, which is not the goal of the policy in the first place. If the goal of the price ceiling is to make the good affordable for people who can't afford as much, often they might not be able to get access to those rent control apartments anyway, because they're being taken by people who have a little bit more leeway getting their way in the system. New York City is a good example of this. where a lot of rent control apartments were allocated many, many decades ago and sort of passed on through relations. And that can lead to, concentration of those rent control apartments in the hands of people who don't need a rent control apartment. They might end up in the hands of the rich and powerful. Here's an example. Here's a congressman who had 4 rent control apartments. You're only supposed to have 1, but he managed to get 4. He's not poor. He's a pretty wealthy guy, and yet he managed to get 4 rent control apartments and fill them with antiques. This was a bit of a scandal, but here's a shot from a movie. This is Maureen O'Hara Via Farrow's mansion in New York City, which they paid $3,500 a month for under rent control. Now again, if that went to 11 people living in 11 rooms, that would be exactly the goal of the rent control policy. But instead, it's going to one family who is already very rich, movie stars, and they're paying the rent control price. And it's a big enough mansion you can film a movie in it.